Atamarie kia koutou. Welcome and welcome back to Te Tiriti-based features. I'm going to begin the day and the session in a takeaway with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti he mauri ora. A very warm welcome to this session about the politics of water with Bargh. I want to acknowledge this time of the equinox, this balance between light and dark, and bountiful harvest, so appropriate for this amazing 6 days of sharing that we're having. And I want to acknowledge these national and global times that are affecting all of us, that make it so critical as resistance to come together in this particular way. Ko waiaho. He no-scale aho, many of my ancestors came from the Western Isles of Kotirani. No te whenua moemoea aho. I was born on unceded Warami and Aotearoa country in New South Wales, what's now known as New South Wales in Australia. Always was from time immemorial Warami and Aotearoa country and always will be. He tangata tiriti o, as in the process of practicing and becoming rather than being tangata tiriti. Ko o te poti te kaika in Naine, where I feel privileged to be working and living under the apron of and in relationship with Kaitahu. Ko Alex McMillan tōku ikoa. I'm a public health academic at the intersection of tangata and tai ao. And it's my absolute privilege to be chairing this morning's session with Bargh, which is going to start with some slides and talk and move into a bit more of a fireside kōrero. I want to remind people about the community code, which I hope is about to come up, and ask everyone to abide by this. It's about being open, respectful, generous, taking ideas but not confidential material, speaking from our experience, and not taking ourselves too seriously. I love that last one. I want to remind everyone about the accessibility and live captioning that's happening from our wonderful live captioner, Catherine, and remind people you can interact with each other using the chat and ask questions using the Q&A, and that there are two wonderful moderators, Anjum and Madeline, who will be on hand to run things smoothly. So Maria's work, I want to introduce Maria a tiny bit before handing over the rako, just to let you know about her work that connects politics, constitutional change, intersections between water, energy, biodiversity, and climate. And that work is really highly respected, both nationally and internationally. And it's such a privilege to be able to kōrero with you this morning, Maria. I'm going to pass the rako to you and mana wahine to introduce yourself and make a start. Kia ora.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koe Alex, nau I whakatau I a tātou katoa. Kia koutou e mā taki ana I tēnei ata, e mihi ana. Ko horo te maunga, ko pukaitu te awa, ko Ngāti Kea, Ngāti Tuara te hapū, ko te aroa te iwi, no Ngāti Awa hoki ahau, ko Bargh e mihi ana kia koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody, lovely to be here, and thank you Alex for setting us off on the path of the discussion. To talk about the politics of water. As I mentioned in my pepeha, the main river that I belong to is Pōkaitu, which is located by Horohoro Mountain, te horohoroinga o ngā ringa o Kahumata Momoi. The central puna there is Waikarakia, and that's where our ancestor Kahumata Momoi washed his hands. He'd become tapu, recited a karakia and gave the name for our mountain. The river flows down Pōkaitu past our marae, over the waterfall there, Aotearoa, south to Tahunatara, and south again to join the Waikato River at Aotearoa, where there's a hydro dam. In town, our puna is Karamutakina, nearby where the taniwha Koro Whakatipua lived, and that puna flows into the Utuhina, which flows into Lake Rotorua, to Rotuiti, to Maketu. And on my Ngāti side, the main river that we sort of look at is Tarawera, which was Te Aotearoa. And so I begin in that way, just to really reaffirm this relational worldview, to reaffirm that it is important to acknowledge which rivers you're connected to, which rivers sustain you, and situate yourself in relation to others, other iwi, other awa, and other non-human entities. And I think this reaffirms a relationship between us and the natural world, and reaffirms this as a normal way of being in the world. And I think that's quite important. We know there are other whakapapa in mātauranga around relationships with freshwater and other associated elements, soils, clay, water, weed, kākahi, and so on. This idea of an undivided entity was talked about in Tika Whenua Rivers report. And I think that's one way to think about it as well, to draw in all of those aspects. So a talk on the politics of freshwater could really take us in so many different avenues, and it's hard not to kind of make puns about it. So I'll try to avoid that. But with water being essential to life, you know, our bodies are 60% water. We have aquifers, sodden soils, you know, glaciers, water lifting up to Ranginui and coming back down to Papa. It's sort of all around us. So how do we make sense of the kind of politics of something that's everywhere? And what can we learn? I thought perhaps we'd just start from some of the things that we know. We know freshwater is a taonga. For many of us, there's so many dear memories that are linked with freshwater, jumping off a jetty into the lake, paddling through rapids, drinking crisp, kind of fresh, drinkable mountain water, being in Wairepo looking for watercress, in our case, in our area, smelling sulphur while navigating through and past mud pools, and catching tuna at night. You know, all of these memories are associated with this taonga. On the other hand, we have other kind of memories of balancing on a roof to clean gutters, calling the plumber when the toilet backs up, boiling water when the colour goes a bit funny, and going without showers when the tank's low. You know, these are all memories of treasure, memories of challenge, memories of how deeply impacted we are by water and the world around us, and often decisions that are made elsewhere. And that really reminds me of Anishinaabe scholar, writer, artist Leanne Simpson, and her book that some of you may have read, The Theory of Water, talking about the tuna bringing back news from afar. And this really resonated with me, and I'll just give an extended part of her quote. She says, "The eel came into our homeland as a messenger, telling us that our world making is deeply connected, not just to the species we shared our immediate time and space with, but to people and forms of life all over the world, on the land, in the water, and in the sky. And the eels carried knowledge in their bodies about their part of the worlds or the ocean. If the eels were abundant and healthy, it told people something about the health of their environment and the travel route. It told us something about ourselves as well. If the eels were scarce or thin or sick, then maybe we needed to ease off harvesting and rely on other beings for sustenance. And the same knowledge came from the birds and all the great migrators." So, you know, Simpson is connecting and highlighting her connection with the world, but also reminding us that we need to adjust how we live. We need to adapt our practices based on the news received. And I think many of us are adjusting and adapting, and climate change is certainly bringing that news to us, bringing the news from afar, that things aren't well in other places, and that we must prepare and adjust the way we live. I think the second thing we know is that things aren't well for our waterways and ecosystems here. We have the news from afar, but we also have the news here. Polluted rivers, groundwater unsafe for drinking, 45% of the country's total river length is not suitable for activities such as swimming. This was the case between 2016 and 2020. E. coli on watercress, making it unsafe to eat. Around 80% of councils lack readily accessible quantitative data on residential consumption, which means it's very difficult for them to plan and adapt. We know there are over-allocated catchments, and councils unable or unwilling to cancel water takes, lake levels so low that tuna can't climb as usual to the sea, and droughts really so fierce that the black bracken water is smothering life and the eels are washing up. So that's some of the reality that we do know. We also know that the question of ownership is still not resolved. And if Storm, you can put on the billboard slide. So in 2005, I was really bothered by this billboard, and this is the only photo I got of it, which was on a bus stop. But it proclaims here that there are 4 million careful owners of fresh water, and it was part of a Ministry for the Environment Sustainable Water Programme of Action campaign. And that might be all well and good. Maybe there are 4 million careful owners. The problem with that wording, and what really vexed me, you might say, is that iwi had just been engaging this in the consultation for this water program of action for several years before this, and they had told the Ministry for the Environment over and over again that the issues around sustainable water actually came back to the question of ownership and being part of decision making, and that hapū, iwi, Māori had to be involved in this question and the resolution of the question of ownership before the other issues around sustainability could be resolved. So it seemed fairly cynical for this campaign to have that precise wording when who owned it was a key issue that had not been resolved. And we're talking here, of course, ownership according to tikanga Māori, which means according to Māori law, the relationships, histories, and mātauranga of each of those places. So we don't have that resolution. Māori continue to point out that rangatiratanga has never been relinquished. There's no clear, plain extinguishment of customary ownership. The Waitangi tribunals confirmed in 2012 in their report there that in 1840, the closest equivalent to what Māori had then was ownership of fresh water. In 2019, they recommended the Crown provide some redress for this Māori proprietary right, look at the feasibility of royalties, look at allocation models that would include hapū and iwi, and take urgent action on the under-resourcing of Māori in RMA processes and consider co-governance bodies or a body for fresh water. We know that the Crown continues to insist on its assumption that no one owns water, despite monopolising all the decisions which intergenerationally are impacted by that. So we know that's our kind of context. We have two key groups that are trying to protect and restore waterways by taking the Crown to court for failing to honour Te Tiriti and Māori rights. Ngāi Tahu are awaiting a judgment from the High Court regarding their case, which seeks recognition of their rangatiratanga over waterways into Waipounamu to address the ongoing degradation. That's their whole motivation. And there's an amazing art exhibition that just shows you some of the images of those waterways into Waipounamu. The Wai Manawa Whenua Collective of Māori landowners, hapū and iwi, have also taken a legal case to the High Court, now appealed to the Court of Appeal, to hold the Crown accountable for failing to honour Te Tiriti and uphold Māori rights and responsibilities over fresh water. The High Court decision suggests that assurances given by the Crown in previous legal action, where they gave commitments that they would recognise and make appropriate provisions for Māori rights and fresh water, were not actually legally binding. They were just political assurances and don't give rise to a kind of legal assurance, legal right. So that's being appealed to the High Court, that particular point. So that we know, it's all still contested around water. What else do we know? We know what Māori do when they get a chance to look after water. And so we see restoration projects all over the country, manaakitanga, caring for others, working together. Te Awa Tupua is one of the well-known examples, a kind of beyond co-governance and centering, in fact, the tuna again and their journey in the awa, prioritising Te Awa Tupua as its own legal identity, but also the tuna as a key taonga species there. In Te Aroa lakes, Te Aroa are trying to clean up the lakes, stop pest species, the catfish, try to prevent the golden clam getting in there. Waikato River, we know, Māori involved in that co-governance. Even in the city, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei is restoring wetlands at Pourewa and Ōrākei. So we know these are the things that Māori do to look after water. And we know non-Māori communities want to look after waterways too. We see projects to make room for rivers. We see restoring wetlands, picking up rubbish along waterways, riparian planting, fencing waterways. So working together will really enhance all of these strategies. For the past few years, I've been involved with Ellie Tapsell, Cowan Jones, and a team of others in a project we called Me Tū Auru, researching what governance and policy models have the best environmental outcomes. And the idea was to find the models, the governance models, the policy that would halt the biodiversity decline. And caring for fresh water is crucial to this picture. The three big takeaways from our research was that the biodiversity decline is a product of dominant governance models, spoiler alert. And if you look closely, these are underpinned by assumptions about whether people are part of and related to the environment, so that relational view that I was reaffirming at the beginning of the kōrero, or separate from te taiao and superior to it. And the idea that people are superior to te taiao tends to dominate current government policy and governance models, and results in the over-extraction, draining of wairepo, destroying the homes of our whanaunga, the birds and fish and so on. It indicates that human desires are being prioritised, valued more highly there than the needs of non-humans. And so this enables governance and policy which prioritises, say, export-focused industries that are permitted to externalise their costs to the environment because it's seen as more valuable than, say, the provision of foods on a smaller scale and biodiversity for local people and ecosystems. So, you know, that was sort of the way that governance and policy is enabled by that pretty foundational assumption. So when we compiled this research and evidence, we brought it all together, brought the news from afar, presented it to decision makers, it didn't seem to sway their decisions. And so we realised that baked into the governing institutions that we have, which make decisions about putting tiko in our sea or rivers, for example, is a prioritisation of human desires over other non-human relationships and needs. So in the last 3 years, we can see that these kinds of decisions have accelerated. Attacks on Māori, attacks on te taiao, attacks on the value of water. It's like the tuna have all arrived skinny and alone at the riverside. The third big takeaway from our research, though, was we found that many people want to know what to do. They're keen to help, they want to know how to help, and they want to hear stories to probably build a preposterous future for water, and they really want to give it a go. And so the good news is that despite these projects being scaled back, despite them being under threat, communities are continuing with their restoration, care and protection work. They're working together and they're persevering. And I wanted to just give some examples of these. So we know 3 Water's been repealed. We have this local water done well brought in, has a minimal role in the legislation for hapū and iwi. But councils are still stepping up in many places to insist that the years of meetings, relationship building, cups of tea and effort that they put in to building this connection with mana whenua to be around the table for better decisions won't be undone. My own hapū, Ngāti Kia, Ngāti Tuara in Rotorua have had the ownership of our puna, Karamutākina, returned to us, and a new trust is working with Rotorua Lakes Council on a joint consent to co-manage that water supply for the benefit of the township of Rotorua. Nearby in Tauranga, the Tauranga City Council uses a mauri model and decision-making framework for their wastewater treatment plant at Waiari to assess the impact on surrounding ecosystems. There's an kaitiaki advisory group there too, which includes council, iwi representatives, restoring, protecting and enhancing their awa. And treaty settlement protocols have enabled a lot of that. Nearby again, back down to the Kaituna, Te Maru o Kaituna co-governs the Kaituna River. Again, councils, iwi, all working together. When we look at the broader local water done well picture. So councils had to create water-controlled, well, they had to say if they were creating water-controlled organisations for wastewater, drinking water and stormwater, or if they were going to manage it in-house and so on. And of the different plans that have come forward, you can see them on the Internal Affairs website, more than 60% of those are still partnering and working with Māori in their new arrangements, despite not necessarily having to do so. So that's really encouraging that there's still this keenness to work together. The Natural Environment and Planning Bills proposed to replace the RMA, again, have a very minimal proposed role for Māori, and minimising and deprioritising the National Policy Statement of Freshwater and Te Manawa Te Wai. But many groups are pushing back against that. Greater Wellington Regional Council requesting changes to uphold Te Tiriti. Shamia Makarini, Deputy Chair of Greater Wellington's Te Tiriti or Waitangi Committee, talks about actually needing to strengthen, not undermine, this partnership that they've spent decades building. The Local Government Act was changed, reversed a whole lot of the positive movement we'd seen, and insisted on these referendum all around the country. But 18 councils still retained their Māori wards and constituencies, and that was still a huge increase from 2019. Why does that matter? Because having those Māori councillors in governance roles, part of decision-making, provides that more robust and sustainable decisions can be made. Across to Hastings, again, the Hastings District Council drinking water strategy, which was developed after the Havelock North crisis in 2016. They've built Waiaroha, 2 massive 5 million litre drinking water storage tanks, and a crucial part of that picture has been the relationship with Ngāti Kahungunu, and that's a kind of exciting model of all sorts of sustainability as part of that Waiaroha complex, if you like. In the far north, Lake Ōmāpere, a food basket for Ngāpuhi in the past, now polluted. They're finding solutions there. Doc, Niwa, iwi, all working together. And it just goes on all around the country. There are examples. And it is important in these times where things are under pressure to keep remembering these all over the place. So we need to adjust how we live. That's true, to adapt based on the news received. And so I hope some of these positive examples, though, give you ideas on how we can do that. Where to from here? Well, maybe we need to be a little bit like the tuna, bring the news, speak up for water, bring the news of its surrounding relationships and conditions, and the solutions we're seeing, big and small, and maybe a change of government might also help the tuna in this regard. So, yeah, kia ora tātou.
Ngā mihi nunui, Maria. Thanks so much for that amazing introduction, as well as the beautiful pictures. So we're going to move now to our fireside chat part of our kōrero, and I really loved we were hearing from Annette Sykes on Saturday morning. And she invoked this connection between the idea of a fireside kōrero with ahika and lighting little fires of hope, as she put it, and connecting to whenua, as well as, in this case, importantly, connecting to awa. So this idea of fireside kōrero is really appropriate here. I want to encourage you all to be putting your questions for Maria in the chat. I'm going to start with some questions that I had sort of put together for this kōrero. First of all, Maria, you've provided some really, I think, exciting and hopeful, determined, resistant examples of iwi and hapū-led change and co-governance, as well as their positive effects on important outcomes for awa and for more than human. There's often this question, I think, in Western paradigms that goes something like, how do we scale these up? And I've had some really interesting chats about this idea about scaling recently, particularly in relationship to water. And I'd love to hear how you would respond to this idea of scaling.
Yeah, well, maybe from a different angle, I think sometimes the scale of things can be a bit of the trouble. So if we think of hydro dams, for example, so large-scale hydro dams on waterways are not great. So we wouldn't want to scale those up anymore. But on the other hand, micro hydro, generating electricity on a smaller scale for local communities, has room for tuna to go past, has space for all of these things, our non-human relations, to still survive well in that picture. So I think in some ways I would think proliferation is a better idea, at a local level, on a smaller scale still, but proliferated. And I think to me that makes more sense when we think about water, to keep it still local systems. And I think when we see the context of climate change as well, to me that makes much more sense, storing your water nearby rather than relying on a system where the pipes could break with extreme weather events, flooding and so on. I know tanks can get washed away in flooding as well, but thinking about ways to be resilient in local areas, with electricity too, and then proliferating those everywhere. And I think, again, that also incentivizes and makes possible the kind of retention of those relationships in that local context with those things that are important in those particular places, those people who know each other and have relationships with each other, strengthening that community in order to be resilient. And so I think that's another way of thinking about it, which I think can be quite strong in this context.
Yeah, I think that's a really important angle about resilience and smaller scale ideas. And I think it connects to what you've already said about perhaps the fact that this kind of iwi hapū, our specific approach and partnership has been, and the relationality of that has been resistant to the big P politics in many ways, and that's kind of another kind of resistance piece to that, non-scaled, the smaller scale approach and proliferation of smaller scale approach. I've got some questions coming in the chat that relate to one of my own, and just noting that these these really important examples are happening in the context of substantial swings in kāwanatanga, particularly in freshwater policy, including what seemed like an important step forward that I might come back to with Te Mana o Te Wai being incorporated as the first goal of a freshwater policy statement, and then this huge swing back to prioritizing economic growth, as you've said. And related to that, this proposal now to disestablish the Ministry for the Environment altogether into a super ministry. And I wonder whether you're seeing this sort of, how do you see this balance between the importance of resilient and resistant small p politics at our scale versus the need for more stable and consistent change in big P politics?
Yeah, I mean, that's hard. I guess we can still be very local and be involved in networks nationally and internationally. And I think, a lot of Indigenous groups may be very kind of locally situated, but have these international connections as well. So I think it's, being locally focused and resilient doesn't necessarily mean you can't be part of these broader networks and movements. And I think, changing the government is one maybe first step, but we all still know that baked into the system are certain practices and assumptions that will remain even after that. So a broader constitutional change is still needed. So we need first steps, and then we need to kind of keep our eye on that vision. Yeah, yeah, it's difficult, but I think there's still councils and there are still folks within government agencies that are keen to try to make things happen as much as they can within the constraints at the moment, and then keep looking towards how can things get better.
And did so in terms of that big P politics, how much did Me Tua Uru sort of link to, you've talked about constitutional change, and I want to invoke Mātaki Mai here. How much did it link to those ideas of Mātaki Mai, and what were the first steps that are envisaged in terms of those constitutional changes for freshwater in particular?
Yeah, well, it was really different for everybody. I mean, we were quite inspired by He Puapua as well. You know, the action plan realised the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We thought they had some very sensible ideas about staged steps towards, you know, better care for the environment and things like that. In our action plan, we had different jobs, if you like, for different groups, because there's a sort of different labour that Māori need to do, that tangata tiriti need to do, that's needed at a local government level or a central government level. So we targeted our suggestions in those different ways. Yeah, I mean, we tried to work at all of those levels. We had many wānanga with tangata tiriti groups, with activists and people from the Department of Conservation and other things. We also worked with Māori communities to think about, you know, how this could be actioned in other ways. So it sort of depended. We're involved in that long multi-year review of local government, which sadly didn't really go anywhere, but had some very sensible suggestions. So it depends really on sort of where you're located in terms of what will be best to do. Yeah.
And I think that you speak also to this, again, really hopeful growing of critical mass, both tangata whenua and tangata tiriti critical mass, that sounds as though, you know, it sounds as though the big P politics should be won in a decent democratic process, right? What do you think it is that means that despite a critical mass on the ground, the big P politics at central government level are going in the wrong direction, that we need to be aware of, specifically in the freshwater space? Whose power is it that's being listened to, and how might we work with that?
Yeah, well, I think it overlaps with, you know, we can't, it's difficult to say in the context of water whose power specifically is being mobilised there. I mean, I think it's related to energy, the question of energy and energy companies. So thinking about some of the micro hydro dams on the Waikato in particular, big hydro, not micro hydro, you know, that then impacts the thinking of central government and their willingness or unwillingness to engage with Māori about Māori ownership rights. And we've seen some quite deliberate thwarting there in the courts by wriggling around with legislation and changing things. And I think when it comes to He Mana Te Mano Te Wai, that's similar. There are larger companies that benefit from quite large-scale irrigation for particular sorts of industry practices, dairy being one. We have vineyards as well that in some places are part of that over-extraction of aquifers that's going on, while some marae, so in the Hawke's Bay, marae trucking in water, tanks of water, the vineyards have access to those bores and things. So I think there are industry players, and again, that comes back to what is being valued. I think that's still at the heart of it. what gets valued and prioritized first. And to me, underpinning that is still that assumption that the environment is something over there, and that growth is something kind of over here. And it's not even growth for everybody. When we talk about that, it's particular companies, a particular small percentage of the country. So, I think there's all sorts of misinformation and disinformation that goes along with these discussions. I think, again, the underfunding, we don't want to go too wide, but the underfunding of kind of public media outlets means that they literally don't have time to look at who's behind some of these things. Actually, Greenpeace has done some great work digging through and tracing, following the money in some of these cases. Russell Norman wrote a great piece tracing some of the connections between ministers, people who are lobbying, and changes that literally happened on the ground in relation to irrigation. So you can follow the money in those sorts of ways, and I think, that's a key part of what's going on at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's so important to really kind of to name the commercial interests and the power in policy making in this space. And also what you're saying really connects up, again, already these intersections between freshwater, between energy policy and the centralization of energy rather than distributed kind of resilient energy. And the intersections between freshwater and climate as well when it comes to dairy, when it comes to irrigation, and when it comes to the agricultural emissions as well. And we're finding in our own work these same commercial interests at play across these different policy spaces. And you kind of talked about big hydro in particular and the sort of the centralized powerful energy interests. And there was a question in the chat actually about you may not be aware about a new hydro dam being announced on protected whenua in Te Waipounamu. Are you aware? You might not be aware of that at all. We might not be able to answer your question, I'm sorry, in the chat about that specific hydro dam. But I think we do know perhaps something more general about the need or not for further giant hydro and the impacts of hydro, which is seen as a renewable energy, but actually has huge impacts on the awa. Do you want to say anything about that?
There to me, the question is still, yes, sometimes it's, just because we have a relational worldview with the environment and so on, doesn't mean we can't touch it, but it means that we think very carefully about what we're going to do. And in that case, again, does this, what is the electricity? What is the way in which we're using electricity at the moment? Is it sensible? If government's just agreed for a data centre to be built near Invercargill that will take 6% of the national grid. And so again, thinking, okay, so we've got a sort of increase in demand for electricity and we're electrifying, and that still may be okay. But perhaps if we're thinking about consuming less electricity so that our needs aren't so high, what are the ways in which we can do that? Is it therefore sensible to agree to a data centre which is going to suck up 6% of the electricity? Why not tell them to work out a way to have their own electricity? I mean, I don't think the data centre is a good idea, but putting that to the side, who are the big users of the electricity at the moment? And so I think there's a more fundamental question to start with before we get to the big hydro dam. Maybe if we're thinking about the need to use less of the Earth's resources, because we know we've already busted through so many of the planetary boundaries, and we really shouldn't be scaling anything up in that sense. We need to be thinking, what can we do less of? Or do things more sensibly? What do we really need? If we need a hydro dam, can it be micro? Can it be mini? Can it be at a smaller scale? What is the electricity needed for? Is it needed, or is it for something like a
wild, like AI?
Wild.
Yeah.
remembering we're using too many of the planet's resources. We need to be, and when I say we, not all of us, just some of us. And so I think, those who are using too much need to use less. There are still families that are struggling that don't have enough electricity. So this is the inequities that we see. And I think, you've been part of that Indigenous justice climate tool, a policy tool. I haven't quite got it right. But to assess some of these policies when we're thinking about this, and that seems to me very sensible. How can we think carefully about the justice question here? Where are there inequities already? People who do need more electricity. It's probably not a data centre. It's probably families that have not enough income to keep the heaters on, and so on. So yeah, I think thinking carefully about what the use is first, and how do we actually try and those of us using too much consume less.
I want to come back to that consumption question in a minute. My brain's going in a number of different directions, but I want to talk about just come back to we're connecting up these different policy spaces. We're connecting up climate and energy and fresh water, and come back to this proposal for a super ministry that swallows up the Ministry for the Environment, which uses those kinds of integrative arguments. But I wonder what you think about that, and whether it indeed will be more integrative, or whether the environment will disappear in that super ministry, whether the rights of the more than human or the prioritization of the more than human will disappear without a Ministry for the Environment.
Well, we haven't seen any indication that the aim is to ensure that the care and attention continues for the environment. That whole project is much more framed as an efficiency drive, where people's jobs are cut. And so the things that they were looking after or paying attention to will no longer have somebody paying attention to them in the environmental space. And we can see, again, the more fundamental prioritization of growth in a narrowly conceived sense, continuing to be prioritized. So I don't think it's possible, given what we've seen of the publicly available aims that have been put forward. So it seems more of a rationalization than
an integration.
Integration.
But could you see that can you problematize the siloing of these issues across say government ministries at the moment, and a view towards better integration? What would that look like to you?
Well, better integration would, we had previously different well-beings, this idea of well-beings, and to me, something like that as your cornerstone or oranga or something else, that would make sense. But that would be your aspiration, would be the order of the whenua, whenua oranga, tangata oranga tangata. I'm not going to say tamariki, but the well-being of these things, if that was at the heart, then it would make sense for things to be interconnected and sit together, so that decision makers could have knowledge of those things. So that would be bringing up a more holistic view, and their justice would be certainly threaded through it. Te tiriti, tikanga Māori as the first source of law would have to be part of that picture as well. And I think, that would make a lot of sense, but I don't think that's what's on the table here.
No. I mean, I so often try and get my colleagues in the Ministry of Health to even talk to my colleagues in the Ministry for the Environment, and that's hard enough. But as you say, the priority at the moment is not integrative. It's economic and so-called efficiency. There's a really great question in the chat that I think relates to something that I wanted to bring up. One of your what to do points is really about speaking up for the awa, speaking up for Te Wai, speaking up for freshwater policy where it might be seen as out of scope. For example, population health nutrition is the example given, food and drink spaces where our, how do we think about this, but also for people who at the moment understandably are really most concerned about affordability of just everyday living. How do we connect up, for example, cost of living as a political decision, and speaking up for fresh water? How might we connect those things? So really, I feel like that's quite a challenging question.
Yeah, I'm not sure where to begin on that one, thinking in a kind of like literally an urban context or rural. Yeah, I mean, my brain goes a bit to water metering, and thinking about ensuring in places where people have to pay not for water, but the infrastructure of the water, but are paying for water, that people who, definitely, well, that households can have access to water if there's over extraction in that area before larger scale industry or commercial operations. Yeah, that would be something my brain would go to. I'm not sure kind of where the question's wanting a focus.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering about this, that whether energy is also another place of connection there, where part of the unaffordability at the moment is about electricity and rising power prices, and how do we connect up, for example, fresh water with energy resilience and energy affordability more in people's minds? Is that something that you've thought much about?
Well, yeah, I mean, I still keep coming back to self-sufficiency at the community level, and I'm usually thinking about marae sort of situations to think about how can they get a water storage tank and some solar panels, because we know that marae are often used as those resilience emergency hubs and shelter people, Māori and non-Māori, and look after them, keep them warm, feed them. At a community level, I think, there's sort of a question about households, but there's also how can we do things as collectives, I think, at a community scale, which I think strength, I think it's community. We need communities to know each other, to know our neighbours in times of emergency, and we know we've got lots of times of emergency at the moment. And so doing things at a community scale rather than being sort of pigeonholed off either just as individuals or even just households separate from each other, I find that a bit sort of alienating in some ways. But if we can do things more at that community level and think how can we work as a community to ensure our water security and our energy security, and share things, then that to me makes a lot of sense as well. Again, that's not where the current government's going, or no incentives or support for that, but seems to me that still makes quite a lot of sense.
And of course, every time we do that, we are in resistance, aren't we, to that kind of centralizing economic growth approach. Yes. I want to come back to your the importance you placed on pūrākau, on stories about awa, and on emotional connection to rivers in particular. And the question in the chat was really about noticing, it keeps moving, so I'm having to kind of scroll again, noticing in your research and in your work the role of different emotional relationships with political decisions in particular. And I'm thinking, you know, you mentioned Greenpeace, and they've been really effective, I think, at making fresh water an election issue by storifying swimmable rivers and dirty dairying. They use sort of more negative, I think, storytelling to raise awareness and make fresh water an election issue. How might we change that or approach it differently in this upcoming election? How do we need to storify fresh water, do you think?
Yeah, well, I prefer to lead with the more positive, because I find that people are looking for positive solutions in these kind of dark times. People want things that can work and are working, and not, you know, they may not be hugely revolutionary in scale. They might still be small things. They might still be tentative or compromised. But to me, people still want to know what's something hopeful. And in the research we did with Me Tuauru, that resonated again. We talked a lot with Jess Berenston Shaw about surfacing helpful narratives and the ones that you know, connect people to the issues, and really bring up for them that's why I started with that kind of relational context, but also the happy memory, you know, the good memories we have and the challenging memories, but our connections with those waterways or water-related activities, because that, I think, sort of bringing to the surface those thoughts of care and, you know, happiness, then encourage us to remember, you know, what's so important about water, and the context in which it sits. And yeah, rather than the negative way, and I don't think necessarily motivates people. It can make people angry, and there's a whole other kōrero about who at the moment is, you know, weaponizing people's anger. But for me personally, I feel better doing the kind of research that tries to uplift us and motivate us to action, to collectivize, motivate us to action through that care and connection we feel with each other and with our non-human relations.
Thanks, Maria. And we've got, I think, time for just one more question. And I think one of the questions in the chat really relates to, I think, how much do the rights of people, but also I think how much do the rights of the more than human come out in the ways we articulate tiriti principles in policy in particular. I think perhaps the question is getting at. Question is really, maybe I should just read it out. How can the people have security of water if the Crown builds the infrastructure and limits the voice and rights of the people? Are tiriti principles strong enough to voice the concerns of the people, given how dismissive it is of the rights of Māori in particular at present? Slightly, do you feel like you respond to that?
Yeah, so if the question's asking, I mean, we know that the treaty principles, insofar as if we're talking about them as treaty clauses and aspects of legislation, those sorts of treaty principles, maybe with a big P there, you know, we know they're being reviewed, we know they're being removed from legislation wherever they're found, or watered down to mean something totally different. So those aren't going to be a lot of help. However, they have been, you know, so in the RMA, when we're thinking about even having kaitiakitanga as a concept in there, hotly contested by Māori for many decades, but provided some leverage to try and look after waterways, our special places, wāhi tapu and so on. But if we're thinking about actual principles from Te Tiriti, or even aspects of Te Tiriti as a guiding philosophy, I think there's much more, because those would be from a Māori lens sourced in tikanga Māori, then that relational view sits there. We as humans are the youngest species, you know, so of the birds and others who are our tuakana. So that dynamic gives us certain obligations and to kind of put into the mix and think about. So yeah, what's the practices of government and using or misusing treaty principles, which themselves are a watered down version of te tiriti, is not great, but we can still promote certain activities and action in our own areas, thinking about our relational connections, thinking about te tiriti as a way in which we can come together as different communities with shared goals, which I think a lot of our communities do care about these things and are working together. So I think it's kind of mobilising that further.
So again, this contrast between how te tiriti principles are misused in big P politics versus how we can put them into practice ourselves in our own relationships more locally. I want to finish by giving you the chance to say anything else that you would like to say as we wrap up, Maria. Thanks so much. It felt really like it went quite quickly that hour. Is there anything else you want to finish with here?
Not really, but maybe just encourage people to go out and reconnect with some sort of waterway or source or place, and remember how special that is, and then share that with others, share that excitement and that love with others. Yeah, that would be all.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message to end on, that message of personal reconnection and love. And I'm not even going to provide any further synthesis because I think that's such a critical message. So I'm going to I really want to note and thank the sponsors for this conference, spread over the next 2 slides, that the amazing sponsors. I want to thank again our technical support and moderators, Storm in the background doing great tech support here, and to encourage you all to follow the conference, follow on Instagram and watch the amazing recordings. And then I really just want to close us again with a karakia. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapunui, kia wātia, kia māmā, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua i te ara takatā. Koe ara e rongo, whakairia ake ki runga, kia tina, uie, tai kie. Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you to everybody who contributed in the chat. Kia ora.